briefing for Wednesday, the 5th of July. I'm Stephen Ridgway. Fortinet. Yeah, remember not that long ago we talked about a particular vulnerability, CVE 2023-27997, which has a CVSS severity rating of 9.8 out of 10, as in remotely exploitable, pretty dangerous if you want to keep people off your systems. So amazingly, it looks like what do they say, 60% or so of Fortinet devices with the 69% of Fortinet SSL VPN interfaces exposed to the internet remain unpatched, according to researchers who've been using Shodan to determine the patch levels via HTTP responses, which I think is going to be reasonably accurate. I can't reiterate firmly enough how important it is to patch, especially patching internet-facing devices, and especially patching devices which are supposed to be in some way or another technical security controls for your systems. It can't be that hard to patch these SSL VPN devices. Fortinet themselves have asked customers to patch as quickly, patch as soon as possible. So I'm mentioning this again because I want to get the message out there. If you're running Fortinet devices, if you're running this particular set of Fortinet devices, Fortinet SSL VPN interfaces exposed to the internet, unless you are part of that 31% that have patched, the others are vulnerable out there, and there are exploits available. That, by the way, when I say it's 69%, that's not like 69% of 10 devices or something. There are 338, nearly 340,000 devices left unpatched on the internet. It is just inviting attacks and compromises. So get out there if you got them. Patch them, keep up to date. As I have said before and will say again, the timeline between the vulnerability being disclosed and active exploitation in the wild is much shorter than it used to be. There was a time when you could lag a month or 6 weeks or 2 months or even 6 months behind the vendors from a patching perspective, because if you took an ultra cautious view of things from a service management perspective, you want to be certain that when you deploy the patches, they won't break anything. But that was 15 years ago. Now, by the time we've heard of the vulnerability, it will either have an exploit or there will be an exploit very close to being publicly released. So you just have to keep on top of patching. Basic cyber hygiene, keep on top of patching is probably the most important thing that you can do. That's my patching rant of the day. So, on other things, the Iranian APT group Charming Kitten, I'm sure they're not, but there we are, has updated some of its backdoor software. Worth keeping an eye on these things as they change and improve. The potentially previous indicators of compromise may no longer work, or there may be some new indicators of compromise that you can build in to your SIEM and actually get some visibility on. This particular piece of software, malware, is interesting because it caught my attention because it uses the Interplanetary File System, IPFS. IPFS is, by the way, a decentralized network, files are stored and accessed through unique content identifiers. So it's kind of similar to BitTorrent or BitTorrent Swarm or something like that. So yeah, interesting pieces of malware. Also, it detaches the decryption functions from the other functions in the code. So basically ensuring that the malware itself is never written to disk. Now that is, it's not an insurmountable problem for defenders. You can look at stuff as it's running in memory. However, it does mean that there isn't going to be a file written out to disk somewhere that will have a hash that can be identified later and marked as malware. So one to be aware of, and it is worth making sure that the endpoint protection solution that you are using does have heuristics looking at processes and looking at what's being held in memory, as well as what's actually being written, what's written out to disk. So worth a look. Not that much in the way of details at the moment, but I think if you find there are devices using IPFS in your environment and you aren't using it for business purposes, might be worth having a look to see at what is going on there. And then finally from me today, Swedish regulators have fined some Swedish organizations for using Google Analytics. The fine is basically because the Swedish authorities have determined that using Google Analytics is in breach of GDPR, specifically Article 46 brackets 1, which forbids the transfer of personal data to countries or organizations that lack safeguards that warrant safety and legal remediation mechanisms. This follows on from the EU revoking, was it called Privacy Shield or something, which was originally thought to be an acceptable and legally watertight way of transferring data between the EU and the US. It does look like the EU's approach to this is you may not send data to the States. The particular issue here is that GDPR states that if you can identify an individual by putting together lots of bits of information, then any of those bits of information constitutes PII. So it is, I think, I certainly originally very much supported the concepts behind GDPR. I think, though, that the devil's in the detail with this stuff, and I'm not entirely convinced that it is not being used for political or potentially even fine-raising purposes, in addition to actually protecting European Union private information. So one to watch out for, because if this stands, it pretty much means that the use of Google Analytics would be non-GDPR compliant in the whole of the European Union. We also know, we know that Austria, France, and Italy have had issues with this in the past. Sweden clearly does now. The UK, whilst no longer in the European Union, still follows GDPR. For obvious reasons, because messing up data transfer between the UK and Europe would be quite messy indeed. So that's an interesting one to think about. Google Analytics, of course, I think a lot of organizations just use it because it is very easy to use. It's part of this suite of very useful tools. But if the data goes to the States, you may find yourself being faced with a fine. So that's it from me today. Hope you have a great Wednesday. It's all downhill to the weekend now, so I will speak to you again tomorrow morning.